Did you know that Britain once went to war with Spain over an ear? Yep, a pickled ear. What followed was a Caribbean fiasco of disease, bungled assault, and one of Britain's worst military disasters. This is the War of Jenkins Ear, possibly Britain's stupidest war. In today's episode, naval historian Tom Goldingly joins me to tell the full shocking story of the War of Jenkins Ear and the assault on Cartagena. From underprepared regiments and chaotic night attacks to political blunders and tropical horrors, we unpack how an ambitious show of force turned into an embarrassment for Britain.
The War of Jenkins Ear is essentially a large trade war between Britain and Spain that spirals into the War of Austrian Succession and really is a properly colonial war. There's no fighting on the European continent that isn't wrapped up in the War of Austrian Succession. So the actual casus belli and the name are slightly different to the deep root causes of the war. The British merchantry are getting increasingly upset and annoyed over the Spanish de Guardacosta. So they are, the Coast Guard is not the best literal translation. I mean, it's the literal translation, but it's not the best idea of what they are. They're basically privateer customs officers who are charged with hunting smugglers and are pretty ruthless about it. And
I'm guessing they probably get a cut of everything they take, do they?
These guys are letter of marque. They're not civil servants. So if you raid a British ship and you take all their sugar, there we go. So the issue that the British are having is that they sign this Asiento, and the way the Spanish Empire works is it's not free trade. It's even more mercantilist than most other European colonial systems at this point. So they won't let foreign powers trade with their colonies. Now, there are certain exceptions to this. One is the Asiento, and what that is an agreement that a provider, whoever it might be, is allowed to provide enslaved people from Africa to the Spanish Americas. Britain wins that right, or that agreement, that trade deal, from Spain in 1713 at the Peace of Utrecht. And the Spanish they're not hugely happy that the British have squeezed this concession out of them. What the Asiento enables the British to do is actually start trading with the Spanish colonies, and that's something they've wanted to do for a long, long time. It's not just the slave trade that they're interested in. It's the use of that fig leaf to trade other stuff as well. Obviously, the slave trade was very profitable at the time for certain people involved in it, but the smuggling of other goods via that mechanism was the main thing.
Short version, Spain runs a closed shop. Britain sneaks in through a slave trading contract, smuggles everything else, and Spain's coast guards aren't having it. Cue outrage in London.
The Spanish are granted the right by the Treaty of Seville to search ships they believe are trading with their colonies illegally. What this actually leads to is a series of what the British would call depredations on their merchant shipping in the Caribbean, and it does get quite bad.
Yeah.
So the name Jenkins Ear, which I guess is kind of it's a bit of a misnomer. So 1731, so this is 10 years before the British are actually fighting in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
A guy from Llanelli, Jenkins, is a merchant captain and is taken by the Guardacosta. So the story goes, his ear is whipped off. And among his sort of supporters, his promoters, is a chap who will be famous for the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin.
Okay.
This is back when he was a quite staunch proponent of the British imperial system.
When he was a goodie, basically.
Yeah. Before he got all wound
before he
up
became a traitor.
Active. Yeah, exactly. And threw in his lot with that dangerous crew, George Washington, who has a relation to the Cartagena campaign. And,
wow.
We can get into that later. Yeah, with the American contingent. So Jenkins has his ear cut off. There's illusions that this ear is presented in Parliament in the Commons at a speech, and given we have Hansard, there's no record of this, right? So a lot of this is kind of the classic Victorian embellishment of these stories.
Yeah.
But it is true that the Spanish were quite aggressive. So in 1737, they captured 10 British ships, so just under one a month in the Caribbean, which was too much for the British merchantry to bear.
Yeah.
And the opposition in Parliament, so this is the time of the Whig oligarchy under Robert Walpole, who is in some ways quite a relatable modern figure. He's this kind of liberal or progressive are the wrong terms, but the Whigs would see themselves as the defenders of the Glorious Revolution in 1688, right? He is this great man of a modern British state astride it.
Yeah.
And he is anti-war. He does not like the idea of war with Spain. He thinks the forward is peace and prosperity through trade and peace through prosperity. And he is dead set against not going to war. But eventually, the opposition, who are the Tories, so that again, it doesn't translate well into modern politics, but the kind of the more pro-Jacobite parts of British political life, and what you would call the Patriot Whigs, they're pro the Glorious Revolution in 1688, the Bill of Rights, and all of that kind of stuff. But they are also pro, the great British tradition of basically going out and thrashing the Spanish on the Caribbean Sea. They kind of snooker him into a corner of, we have to go to war, and the clarion calls for war really get too loud. They decide to go to war in June of 1739, but the actual parliamentary "we are at war with you" declaration doesn't happen until October 1739. So this is a really, this is 26 years of a really difficult situation with Spain and Britain. Lots of commercial and banking issues mixed in with kind of the military clashes and tensions, and people like the Royal Navy. So one of the greatest proponents of going to war is Admiral Vernon, one of the senior officers in the Royal Navy, who is an avowed patriot Whig. He is leading the charge of, let's go, let's win this war, and let's show the Spanish what for.
Walpole wants peace and trade. The opposition wants Spanish blood. By 1739, they've got their war, though they've no idea what they're unleashing.
Britain was relatively disarmed in this period. They are still worried about the idea of a standing army oppressing the British people. So I believe, including the Guards, the entire British army, that includes the British establishment and the sort of slightly constitutionally separate Irish establishment, as well as garrisons in places like Nova Scotia and Minorca and Gibraltar, and including the Guards, is only 45 battalions. So that is a paper strength of 45,000 men. Now, obviously, you've got the cavalry and the artillery, but the 45 battalion of infantry figure gives you some kind of idea of how small this army is. Now, the Navy is in a much better shape. They have a lot of ships that are active, but they also have a lot of ships in what they call ordinary. So ships that they have basically sitting around harbours in places like Portsmouth and Plymouth that they can rearm and equip to go out quickly. The problem is they don't actually have the men to do that. It takes them a long time to man a fleet to go to war. Britain's in kind of a bind as well, because the opposition want to go to war, but they don't want to expand the army. Partly, I sense that's because they wanted to snooker the government and get them to and get Walpole out.
Yeah.
Partly, that is that genuine concern that the army would be a tool of oppression. And they're in a bit of a difficult situation because the King George II, so his father has come from Hanover. George II, I believe, was born in Hanover. He is worried about a Jacobite uprising. So he says, you cannot take the regular army and send it on an expeditionary war against Spain.
Gosh.
Because if you do, there will be, the French will invade, the Jacobites will uprise, and I will be overthrown. So he basically says, I don't want any regular troops going. Eventually, he consents that 2 regular battalions will go out with the army to the Caribbean. And we can talk more about that in a minute. But really, Britain's military preparedness, the army is in a terrible state in the 1730s and 40s. Since they fought a real war in Europe, the one expedition to the north of Spain in the early 1720s aside, we are talking 25 years of continuous peace. So most of the officers below the rank of general will never have seen serious action before. Right. Some of them will have fought the Jacobites in 1715, 1719. Some of the guys that will lead the expedition fought under Marlborough, but fought in relatively junior roles. And the army itself isn't concentrated. So battalions aren't, as they are now, barracked in a barracks on a base where they train and live together. They're billeted around the countryside. So one of the regiments that provides recruits to some of the units that are raised for Cartagena, the Cartagena expedition, that only spends I think it's 13% of its time in about a decade as a cohesive unit.
Oh, wow.
Most of their time is spent helping the revenue service hunt smugglers. So it's aid to civil power stuff. They're not as a full unit. The army's, it's seen as a relatively corrupt and idolent institution, I think it's fair to say, in the 1730s.
Yeah.
So they're really going to struggle raising an army to go to the Caribbean.
So, a small peacetime army, not enough men for the navy, and a king terrified of Jacobites. A perfect recipe for a tropical adventure.
So there are two pre-war regular battalions that go out. They raise an additional 6 battalions of what are called Marines. And they also raise a newer regiment of 4. So the issue we talk about regiments and battalions is the British Army classically has regiments that have multiple. Most of the times these days, the word regiment and battalion are interchangeable. Most of them only have one at this point. I'm about to completely contradict myself by saying they raise an American regiment that has 4 battalions that's raised from recruits in the American colonies, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But the 2 regular battalions that go out, one becomes the 15th Foot. So this is the period where there's still that kind of lingering aristocratic feudal sense in the army, that's sort of reminiscent of the 17th century and earlier. So a regiment's still named after its colonel. So one of the ones that goes out is Harrison's. That becomes the 15th Foot.
Yeah.
And being from South Wales, I'm very happy to say that one of the regiments that goes out is the it's called Wentworth's Regiment of Foot. It becomes the 24th Foot, the South Wales Borderers.
Oh, yeah, heard of them.
It's Sandalwana, Rorke's Drift, lots of VCs. Don't ask too many questions about what happened on the day. All of that kind of thing. So they're 2 of the regiments that go out. They are kind of considered a bit of an elite on the expedition, and they perform well with some serious caveats.
Right.
The opposition don't want to increase the size of the standing army too much. But they need more troops to go to the Caribbean because the king won't let them send the army that already exists. So the government is in a catch-22. So they say, we'll raise marine regiments because marines implies naval service, it implies overseas service, it implies expeditionary service, and the expectation of the public in 1739 is we're going to the Caribbean to fight Spain. Whether or not that's what they actually end up doing, that's the expectation. So the Marine regiments are officially authorised by Parliament on the 27th of November, 1739. And 6 regiments, 6 battalions are authorised to be created. Now, these battalions have been massively criticised at the time. And again, I'll just quote from a contemporary, if I may. Sorry. Right. So this is Captain Sir Charles Knowles of the Royal Navy. This is a contemporary description of the Marine regiments that are raised, and he calls them raw, new, raised, undisciplined men is a factor known to everyone, and the greatest part of their officers commanding them, either young gentlemen whose quality or interest entitled them to preferment, or abandoned wretches of the town whose prostitution had made them useful on some dirty occasion.
Brilliant.
Just the most damning thing you can possibly imagine, and that is the view that has been progressively built upon to say, well, that's not right, that's probably not true. It's almost certainly just nonsense, frankly. So these regiments had a paper strength of just over 1,000 men. So they've got 120 corporals or privates are drawn from the foot guard battalions to act as sergeants and other NCOs in these regiments. They also get each Marine battalion, so there are 6 battalions raised, they each get about 300 men from existing battalions of foot to act as corporals, sentries, and drummers. So on paper, this means a third of your men, your rank and file, your other ranks, are either foot guards or existing regular infantry.
So they should be pretty solid.
Yeah, so stand fast all that stuff about the British Army not being particularly well trained in the 1730s. They should, in theory, know what they're doing. And that is even more further reinforced when you look at the fact that when they actually go to the Caribbean, they never hit that 1,100 Marine target. They are about 750. Is the kind of average, around 750 is the average, which means about half of your men in every battalion are going to be pre-war regulars, which is a pretty good backbone for a newly raised regiment. Most of the officers were half pay or commissioned from other regiments. But really, if you look at it, that experience is quite shallow. So you have a few very experienced officers as sort of maybe as first lieutenants.
Right.
And we're talking some of the first lieutenants, they have a couple of years commission experience in a peacetime army that's doing anti-smuggling duties or aid to the civil power. Like they aren't experienced soldiers.
Yeah.
So the experience in the army is very shallow, and when the army loses those much more experienced sort of captains and majors and some of the first lieutenants, it really starts to show that the younger officers under them, they know what they're doing theoretically, but they don't have that long body of experience that you see in the army later in the 18th century.
So the expedition's built on a patchwork of regulars, scratch-raised Marines and an American regiment. Some solid troops, but lots of raw ones. But who was in charge?
So you have the commanders who were appointed in London and the people who actually end up commanding the army. They're not the same men. So the Navy is under the kind of overlordship almost of this sort of larger-than-life figure, Admiral Vernon. Old Grog, he's the guy who invents the classic rum, water, lime mixture to combat scurvy.
Right.
He is the guy who captures... So war is declared in October 1739. He sets sail almost instantly, goes to the Spanish Main and captures Portobello in a brilliant coup de main with no army support, takes the city. The Spanish bottle it, frankly. And it really is one of the great sort of Royal Navy victories, hence Portobello Market in London today.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, is that what it's named after? And then my second quick follow-up question is, where is it?
It is, Portobello is on the northern coast of South America. Panama, yeah. So Portobello is in Panama. He then tries a couple months later to do a naval-only escapade against Cartagena, which is now in Colombia. Its real name is Cartagena de Indias. That is its literal name in English is Carthage of the Indies. So it's named after a city in Spain that's named after Carthage. So it's got this like really ancient lineage, and Vernon tries to seize it on his own and fails. But he's the kind of the big man of the expedition. The army is supposed to be led by a chap called Lord Cathcart, from a pretty famous Scottish military aristocratic family. He's kind of the second general of the kingdom in terms of experience. So he was a staff officer during the War of Spanish Succession. His second in command is a guy called Alexander Spotswood, who had been the governor of Virginia. So when I said they wanted to raise an American regiment, they're going to raise 4 battalions. It's going to be called Spotswood's Regiment. So he's going to be the colonel. 4 battalions raised from the British colonies in North America. So what is now the kind of northeastern to north middle US. So Maryland all the way up to Massachusetts. They're going to, and Virginia, they're going to form this regiment. Spotswood is probably most famous for being the guy who sponsors the expedition that kills Blackbeard.
Oh, so okay. The famous pirate.
Yeah, yes, the famous pirate. This war's really interesting because a lot of people who had fought under kind of, they'd lived through the Glorious Revolution, they'd fought under Marlborough, they'd done the whole golden age of piracy. They end up passing the torch to people who will fight in the French Revolutionary Wars in the 1790s. So there's a real generational shift. Anyway, Spotswood and Cathcart both die as the expedition is being prepared. Cathcart actually dies the day the expedition reaches the first waypoint in the British West Indian Isles.
Their commander dies as they arrive in the West Indies. Leadership falls to Thomas Wentworth, a diligent but cautious man. Worse, decisions will be made by council. Ooh, a recipe for dithering. But what about those important specialist officers?
This is before the establishment of Woolwich as a big military training institution. So they send out one engineer who's very experienced, but he dies quite early on. Again, they're really quite unlucky with senior officers copping it. And about half of the rest of the engineers are actually just gentlemen volunteers. They're not trained military engineers. So this is before the engineers and the artillerists in Wellington's day, who are probably the best trained men in the army. There's no Major Hogan at Cartagena.
So what happens then? So they get out to Cartagena, and do things go well at the beginning?
No, not really.
Oh no.
So it's worth saying that it takes them, like, frankly, ages to get out to the Caribbean. So they get to the Caribbean in January. So they arrive at Dominica, so that's near Saint Lucia in the Windward Isles. They get there in December, where they bury Lord Cathcart is still buried on the beach in Dominica. Apparently, there's a monument to him, and if I ever get out there, I'd quite like to go and see it.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, and they get to Jamaica in early January. When they get to Jamaica, they meet the American units who've come down from Virginia, who've come down from Massachusetts, and they find that they've not been properly fed while they're on Jamaica, and they've not been given proper uniforms, or a lot of them haven't been given proper uniforms. So there's a lot of hangry. Well, that's a perfect term for it, I guess.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hangry Americans who aren't very well clothed, who are quite upset that they've been press ganged into this.
Oh no.
Probably not quite as bad as the British situation, where 8% of them are dead and 23% of them are sick before they get to Jamaica, or as they get to Jamaica, basically.
Right. Classic West Indies, that, isn't it?
It's probably worse than anything that would come later. So right. Yeah, there's the classic West Indies dimension of everybody dies, but it's sort of a lot of them have had typhus and scurvy and other sort of fevers before they've actually got to the Caribbean.
Oh wow.
So they've taken of the troops that arrived from England, who are unquestionably their best trained, best equipped troops. They've lost nearly a third of them.
A classic West Indies welcome. By the time they even form up, a third of the men are dead or sick at least.
They arrive off the coast of Cartagena, in what is now Colombia, in March 1741. Basically, Cartagena sits at the north end of a very large lagoon that has a thin entrance called the Boca Chica, a very thin entrance to that lagoon. And that's really the only way you can get into the city. And that's guarded by the fort of San Luis. There's another small fort in the middle of the channel, and there's another battery on the southern side. And the fort itself of San Luis is guarded by two small batteries. And the British get there on the night. The Navy naval gunfire support. Boats go in. What they do is they do the classic thing of they form an converged grenadier battalion. They take the grenadier companies from the Marine regiments and the pre-war regulars. These are the real hard men.
All the big lads.
Yeah, the big blokes from Gloucestershire who really just want to get a bayonet and go for it.
Yeah.
They basically, there are two versions of this story. One, and I'm not really sure which of these is worse, to be perfectly honest with you. One, they sit in front of the guns of the Spanish batteries, not actually knowing whether or not they've been silenced, just hoping they're not there anymore for a couple of hours. The other one is they land, think, we haven't got quite enough men to do this, so retreat and wait for more grenadiers to arrive. So either way, it's slightly abortive.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not great. What happens next is a lot more positive, however. So this is the 9th. They spend the next 2 weeks basically conducting a very formal European siege of the fort of San Luis. And you could argue whether or not an army later in the period would have done this. Yeah. Or whether or not they'd have tried their luck of an escalade at night. The fortress, I suppose the British weren't to know this, the fortress wasn't in the best state, and the garrison might have given it up. So they spend 2 weeks trying to conduct a formal siege. Vernon, this sort of bullish, like I say, almost Elizabethan character, sort of thing, oh, well, these Spanish fellows won't stand, decides to sail his fleet against the two forts guarding the mouth of the entrance to the lagoon on the 23rd of March without the army support. He thinks Wentworth is a ditherer. There's some truth in that, but this is really quite silly what he does next. Yeah. He hurls his fleet against the batteries of the forts, and 3 ships of the line are almost completely written off for almost no loss to the Spanish. About 18 hours later, Wentworth has a practicable breach.
Gosh. And
takes the fort in a couple of hours with very little loss. I think 3 men are killed and wounded from the British force. The Grenadiers go in. They're very tense. They do quite. There's some really good accounts of them doing sort of almost proper light infantry work of arms at the trail, up over the rubble, through the defensive works. But the Spanish have basically decided the position isn't practicable anymore, and they flee. Over the next couple of days, they're also able to take the other batteries at the harbour mouth and on the side of the entrance. So by the end of March, They're in the lagoon. They're in Cartagena harbour. They are ready to go. It takes them another week or so to get themselves in order, get the ships warped up. So that's hauling on the anchors to get them into a position to actually land the troops. Again, this is all quite slow. And in the West Indies, you are always against the clock in this period. You are against the clock of, if you do not achieve your objectives within sort of 6 to 8 weeks, your men are going to start to die of yellow fever or malaria. If they're not well supplied, they're going to start dying of scurvy and dysentery as well, and typhus. So they take another few weeks to get their troops in position. And the grenadiers, again, under the command of a chap called Colonel Grant, who will become quite important later, land on the 5th of April. And they're advancing up this jungle track through the landing point. And they're met by a wall of Spanish regulars. And they're advancing up this narrow jungle track, so they can't deploy into line. What they do is they execute perfectly. And all of the sources are pretty clear on that they do this to the book. A maneuver called street firing, which is you're advancing in sort of a column of platoons down a street. The idea is that this is for urban fighting. And the front platoon fires a volley and then peel off down the side of the column. The next platoon moves forward, fires a volley, and the same thing happens again. And what the British are able to do is just generate this massive rolling fire against the Spanish, who break and run. The Grenadiers chase them for quite a way, actually.
Yeah.
All the way towards this fortress called San Felipe de Barajas, which the British call the Fortress of San Lazaro, or San Lazaro, which is the kind of the fort right outside the city. That's their the kind of the last linchpin of the Spanish defense before they have to rely on the defense of the city itself. And Wentworth is there. He's landed following the Grenadiers, and he calls them back. He says, no, don't try and get in with the Spanish army and chase them all the way into the city or all the way into the fort. Don't do that. And people have really criticised him for it. And I'm not one of the sort of Wentworth apologists. There are people who think he was a guy dealt an unfair hand, and in some ways he was. I think he made the right call. His Grenadier battalion is like, they are the best guys he has, and there's about 450 of them, and he's not getting any more out of an army of about 10,000. You need to keep them intact. So what they do is they end up at this place called the La Popa Convent and the village of La Quinta, looking down the plain. There's the Fortress of San Lazaro on this sort of like slightly tadpole-shaped hill, and the city of Cartagena and its suburb of Gethsemane and their fortresses. And the British are a couple of miles away from their objective.
Yeah.
And that's how it's gone. Now, it's been for very little loss. They've lost a lot of time. It's been quite slow, frankly. I'm saying this is sort of a slight Navy partisan. The Navy is slightly embarrassed itself, really. They didn't need to do the whole bother of lying themselves alongside a fort and trying to batter it to death.
Yeah.
But the army's acquitted itself well. It's sort of this juddering, ponderous, but they're getting there. They're in the position to do the right thing.
Yeah.
But crucially, their chief engineer has been killed, and that will play a major role in what happens next.
And so now there's another serious fortification that needs capturing. The generals argue siege or storm. The Navy won't lend men. Wentworth caves in. A night assault it is. Blakeney warns, this will not work. He's right.
I think I can understand the pressures on both sides. I tend to think that the option to storm was right, but they should have waited a few days to try and get some advancements in siege works, advance some trenches, do a bit more recce. So San Lazaro, it's that kind of almost triangular-shaped fortress. It's on a pretty sheer cliff. If you go there now, the fortress still exists, but after this, it shows you how much more of a close-run thing the Spanish thought this was. They have completely rebuilt this place. The hill, the original fort is still there, but it's now the centre of a massive citadel. The entire hill has been fortified. But originally there was a very steep face of the hill facing the British, so that would be to the east. And to the north and the west, much smoother. To the north is also a steep face. To the sort of the west is a much smoother hill. And the south, they're much easier inclines. So the plan, they've got some Spanish deserters who are willing to lead them. The plan is that they're going to outflank this triangular fortress. So the Spanish have built on either ends of the triangle facing the British. So if you imagine the flat side of the triangle is facing the British, they've built 2 batteries of wood and mud, and they've got guns in them. They've also built a hornwork, a fascine hornwork, extending from the, I guess it would be the sort of northwestern part of it. The idea is they've got this hornwork extending out from the fortress, And they're going to loop round and attack the fortress from the rear, where they believe there's an easy entrance. In reality, it's questionable or not whether that entrance was there. So the plan they have is that the 24th Foot, led by this guy Colonel Grant, who led the Grenadiers, so this is the South Wales Borderers, the Royal Welsh, they are going to hook round and attack the north of the sort of northwestish of the fort. The Grenadiers and elements of the 15th Foot are going to hook round the kind of the western face of the hill, the southwestern face of the hill, and they're going to attack the gap, the smooth slope in the gap between the city and the fortress. And they're going to storm it with ladders and grappling hooks, and they're going to swarm over the walls in the undefended part of the hill. Because what the Spanish have done is they've actually built trenches on the hill, so that if the British do come straight up the path, they're going to be able to hold them off. So what happens is the British set out, and they set out in the very small hours of the morning. But the way they do it, it takes so long for them to form up that the column doesn't even get moving until 3 o'clock in the morning. So there's a guy called Colonel Wynyard, who's one of the colonels of the Marine Regiment, who's there as a sort of almost a commander. He's going to lead the Grenadiers, the 15th Foot, Harrison's regiment, and some American troops. So the only real action the American regiment sees at Cartagena is as unarmed pioneers supporting the British. So they've got wool packs to stuff in any trenches, and they've got ladders to attack the wall. So they set off at 3 o'clock in the morning, and their job is to hook round, attack the soft slope of the hill, and get into the fortress.
Yeah.
The problem is they haven't really recce'd this well. So as this column is trying to march down this, basically it's a goat track in a wood. And there's one of the officers who's there says that 4 men can walk abreast on this track. And they're walking down it in the dark. And a small unit of basically a forlorn hope, essentially, goes out ahead of the British column. And their job is to sweep away any Spanish pickets. The problem is, either by the treachery of the deserter or the British troops getting lost in the dark, they come upon the pickets, and instead of sort of, taking them and roughing them up silently, shots are exchanged. Shots ring out.
Yeah.
The advantage of surprise is blown. Now, instead of either calling it off or just deciding to go, or carry on, let's just hope that they think it's pickets clashing in the night.
Yeah.
There's a guy there, Mackenzie, who's one of the Royal Engineer Volunteers, and he notes that the band strikes up British Grenadiers. So they're like, right, surprise is gone, lads. Forward. Now, they exit the goat track, not around the base of the hill, up the soft incline between the city and the fort and into its sort of softer rear areas where there aren't any guns. They exit the wood right into the face of the hill with the entrenchments.
Gosh.
So the British then are forced to, essentially, the hill is steep enough that they are forced to sort of sling their muskets and climb up the face of the hill. Bearing in mind this is the Caribbean at night, so this is like 25 degrees and they're wearing their full kit while they're doing this. So this must have been incredibly difficult. No, so this guy, Lieutenant Waller, leading the Forlorn Hope, they completely blow the elements of surprise. The problem is they're now coming under pretty heavy crossfire, not only from the town, but also from the fort. And this was the whole reason they were doing a night assault. They didn't want to get caught in a crossfire. And they're now basically ploughing forward against an almost sheer face of a hill defended by entrenchments. At the time this is happening, the 24th Foot, who've hooked around the north of the hill, runs smack into the hornwork in its trench. And that's basically when everything gets blown to pieces. So on the northern slope with the 24th Foot, Colonel Grant, who's leading, draws his sword, jumps into the trench and is instantly killed. The 24th, remember what I said about them being, these guys are well trained. They know they know the business of war, but they're not experienced. What they do, instead of either charging the hornwork with bayonets or withdrawing, what they do is they stand there for most of the night. This is probably getting towards 5 in the morning, I guess, at this point. They exchange fire with the Spanish troops in their entrenchments. And they do so very valiantly. And in the good fashion of the 24th, front rank fire, second rank fire for quite some time. So they're pinned. They're basically pinned. Interestingly, the Spanish. This is supposed to be a diversionary attack, and it works. The Spanish, the 24th, are the guys that are going to try and get into the fort because this is the weakest point of it. So they try and bring reinforcements in to the hornwork to deal with the 24th. The problem is the column under Wynyard, the Grenadiers and the 15th and the American Pioneers, they've attacked the wrong face of the hill, so they're not able to take advantage of that. So the Spanish guys in the trenches of the hill, they hold their fire. Actually, they let the British get forward onto the hill. They let them climb that steep incline. They wait until the British are about 30 or 40 yards away and open fire. And one officer described, it cut them to pieces. So their gunfire was described as one perpetual light by one British officer that was there. The Grenadiers leading the column break through the first line of trenches. What they do is then they call for the ladders in the rear. So they're calling for the ladders, like, we're in. The order comes down the line to the engineers, and they say, well, we haven't had an order from Wentworth or from Wynyard. And it's not really clear during this battle who's actually in command of individual parts of the effort anyway. And they say, well, no, we don't want to go because we've not been given the order to take the ladders up. So there's another 6 minutes after the Grenadiers, bearing in mind they're basically being shot from a fortress is firing down into them. Spanish guys that are 30 yards away are firing into them from the trenches. And it takes them 6 minutes to get the order, bring up the ladders and the Pioneers. The Americans, their performance is controversial, but at the time they were sort of seen as, by some of the British officers, they were convicts that were indentured servants that had been sent to Virginia. They were Irish, they were Catholic, they couldn't fight. Later on, this is just obviously nonsense, and they do relatively well, but they're not armed, and some of them break and run away. They're only apparently, and again this is debated. This guy Mackenzie, one of the engineers, says only one American officer and 8 Americans actually stay, and they're only able to manhandle 5 of the ladders up to the wall as dawn breaks at about 5:30 in the morning. Apparently, I mean, to be honest, it just sounds absolutely hellish, the stuff these guys had to deal with. So they breached the Spanish trench line, but it had only been broken in one place, and only the first line of trenches was broken. The Grenadiers didn't actually have many grenades, and a lot of them didn't work. The Americans had actually been given packs of grenades to bring up, but they had either run off or they dropped bags. And the ordnance that they'd brought with them wasn't very good, so the fuses didn't work. The grenades were some of them were too thick, so you'd light the fuse, throw the grenade, and it wouldn't explode because the charge wasn't enough to burst the shrapnel. So the British troops, these guys they're well drilled. They know how they would be able to, in Flanders fields, they would do a fine job. What they don't know what to do is how to do trench fighting in the Caribbean. It's working and gone wrong. What they do is they do exactly what they know. They commence street firing. They think, well, we've got one breach in the line of trenches. This is a narrow obstacle. We want to advance against the enemy. In this situation, you do street firing. So, and this is actually, when I first read this in one guy's account, I thought that cannot be what happened. I then read it in one of the American officers who was watching but wasn't there. Said no, that's basically what they did. They did the platoon firing. So they'd advance, they'd fire, they'd retire. They'd advance, they'd fire, they'd retire. The problem is they're doing this against guys in trenches and behind a fortress wall, and they are, I believe, the phrase that's actually used is they are broke to pieces.
I bet.
So one of the officers, Captain Adair, is shot, wounded, and his men return fire in revenge. And so this is a primary account. The Pashas were so stuffed with our own platoons after firing, retreating, and those advancing, that the platoons at length were all mixed up, and those platoons who could not, for want of room, retreat, were broke to pieces by the enemy's grenades, stones, fireworks, and a sharp fire from all quarters.
So was this enough, Tom, that they finally decided to call this off, or did it keep going even more?
This carried on.
Oh,
So General Grant in his trench is dying, and he says the general ought to hang the guide and the king ought to hang the general. Wentworth had actually accompanied the 24th, which he was the colonel of this regiment, to the hornwork. He is with them and is watching them essentially commence a firefight with a fort.
The Spanish one-legged hero Blas de Lezo throws in fresh troops.
So there's this guy, Mackenzie, this engineer officer, and he's friends with one of the grenadier officers, Captain Dennett. And he'd been shot and killed, and we know that this is true, or at least partially this is true, because we know that Captain Dennett was killed at Salazar because we have the casualty returns.
Yeah.
So Dennett's men know Mackenzie because he's friends with their commanding officer, and they give him his fusil, his officer's version of a musket, and they ask him to lead them. And he leads this kind of mixed up group of grenadiers forward and actually meets this guy, Lieutenant Waller, the commander of the Forlorn Hope. And they're trying to force their way along the front of the fortress under fire to one of these makeshift batteries that the Spanish had built in preparation for the attack. But they realised that the entrenchments and the fascines the Spanish had made were already the height of a man, so 5.5 feet tall. And this guy Waller, who'd led the Forlorn Hope this far, is shot and killed at that point, very tragically. We know again from letters that some of the British troops did gain the walls. They were able to scale them. We believe one American sergeant got on, and a young Scottish officer. There are a lot of Scottish guys in this expedition, and a lot of them are called Mackenzie, and a lot of them are called Campbell. So if you see John Mackenzie has been killed 3 times, it's not the same guy making a miraculous recovery. It's different. It's different fellows.
Yeah.
But this guy Mackenzie was able to get onto the wall. He was hit in the head by a musket, taken prisoner, and then died a few days later. Mackenzie basically decides this is not working, so falls back and finds Brigadier General Wolfe, so the father of Wolfe of Quebec, and he basically tells Wolfe the situation, and in sort of what I can only imagine is sort of the madness driven by the situation he's in. This very junior officer gives his impression to this general, and that the attempt was a failure and should be abandoned. It's really hard to disagree with that. And he actually says that Wynyard's column had been torn to pieces. What they don't know really is that Grant is also dead and his column has faltered. The 24th Foot has failed in its attack. There's a reserve. Wolfe's own regiment of Marines is in reserve, and they've not been committed. But Wolfe is very tentative about sending his battalion forward to be slaughtered in the same fashion.
Why reinforce failure?
Exactly, don't reinforce failure. They didn't have any chance of ascending the southwestern flank without being massacred, and that's his assessment. So Mackenzie leads a small party around the base of the hill to see if they can attack the other side of the fort, the kind of the unengaged side. And what he meets there is Blas de Leso's reinforcements, and he goes back and tells Wolfe this. Wolfe then was able to apparently pick out Wentworth, and they have a sort of commanders conference. Wentworth actually says, no, we've got to keep going. That we have to drive, that we have to keep going forward. We will gain the fortress if we keep pushing. I think that's frankly mad. And the sort of the Wentworth defenders would say, this bad situation. He wasn't an incompetent officer. He was not the guy you send to do this. This is the equivalent of Southern Hemisphere rugby or baseball cricket. You don't send your night batsman or your second choice Wales hooker to go and command this effort. This is the real stuff.
Yeah.
So when Mackenzie gets back to Wolfe, he's in conference with one of his subordinates. One of Wentworth's subordinates, Guise. And he says, no, that Wentworth's ordered that we push the assault. They actually countermand Wentworth. They're not together at this point. They're communicating through runners. And Mackenzie says, no, Wentworth's order we carry on the assault. And Guise, who's actually better known for being a slightly eccentric art collector than a general, and Wolfe, who's best known for being the father of a famous man, they both say, no, this is mad. We're stopping now. And what they do is that they begin to pull back. As the British pull back, the Spanish surge forward. And there are a couple of competing accounts. Some people, one British officer who's involved, Lord Elibank, who later becomes a Jacobite. I think partially because this whole thing goes so badly wrong. It's nothing like politically radicalised you, like unbelievable levels of failure. He says, no, this was a well-ordered withdrawal from the hilltop. Basically, every other count, the British Scarpa and Wolfe's battalion is left holding the field to dissuade the Spanish counterattack. Burrard also says the retreat was quite orderly, but again, if you actually read Burrard's letters, he's quite he's quite a sanguine, sort of dry fellow. I think I really shot through the back of the leg. They didn't take my knee. He's that kind of very Georgian chap. And that's it for the attempt on San Lazar, and really that's it for the attempt on Cartagena. So
and is that's it for the war as well, or
no? There's even more quixotic. So that they stay in Cartagena for another month, trying to take it. But really, the heart's been ripped out of the army. Harrison's regiment, the 15th Foot, the 24th Foot, and the Marine Grenadiers are decimated. And these are the only guys that Wentworth has any real faith in being able to do assaults. Yeah. And I think there's a fair reason for that. They are the kind of best of his men, and the British Army in this period, like I've said, it's not the army that we see at the Battle of Camden or the Peninsular War. It's not that force. Yeah. So they spend another month waiting, and really, this is an army they shouldn't have sent to do this job. And eventually, they evacuate. They lose about 600 men killed and wounded in that 4 hours.
Right, that's quite... I mean, I don't know as a percentage of those engaged, but I'm guessing quite high.
They only lose just under 1,000 men in the whole West Indies campaign to enemy action.
Right.
So they lose almost half of that on one night.
Yeah.
It's as a percentage of the guys involved in the action, if you think each battalion is going to be about 400 men, 500 men at this point, they attack the fortress with around 1,500, so they lose
pretty half. Catastrophic. Yeah, catastrophic level of casualties.
Unsustainable.
Hundreds dead in one night, thousands more rotting in hospitals. The survivors sail for Jamaica, only to be sent on an even crazier scheme. They try to found a colony at Guantanamo. No food, no water, then a hurricane. By Christmas, barely 1,000 men are fit to stand. So on the whole, bit of a mess. After 1742, Britain and Spain focused their combat power on the War of Austrian Succession in Europe. And then in 1748, fighting came to an end with a treaty that left Britain falling well short of their original territorial and economic ambitions. So what's learned? Don't send a B team into the tropics. Yep, that goes without saying. Later expeditions, though, are better. Havana, St. Lucia, because of that blood spilt at Cartagena and the lessons learned. We Brits love a noble defeat, but this one wasn't noble, it was just a disaster. But it does deserve to be remembered for the men who died and for the lessons learned. My thanks, of course, to Tom Golding Lee, top bloke. Follow him on X, where his handle is @TDG Naval History. He also has a blog, The Seat of War, check that out. Oh, and as I'm editing, a bit of breaking news from Tom. He and friend of the show Marcus Cribb, I'm sure a lot of you know him, are running a battlefield tour, Jacobite battlefield tour. Should be really good fun. If you're interested in the Jacobites, you're going to like this. They're going to go to Preston Pans, Killiecrankie, Culloden, loads of good stuff. And if you want more from me, head to redcoathistory.com. Books, tours, merch, all supporting the channel. While you're doing that, watch the video that's on screen now. I think you'll really enjoy it.